She lived alone, but her mailbox was always empty. Welcome to Migrate's Casebook. I am your host, Elderton. Drop a comment. Where are you listening from tonight? Your voices turn silence into community. Let's step into the mystery together. It was a point of some local pride in East Wrotham that Mrs. Penbury had never, in all her 47 years of widowhood, put pen to paper. Not for lack of literacy, indeed, she had once been a schoolmistress of formidable grammar, but by preference. Letters, she declared, were common things, prone to interception and vulgarity. If one wished to communicate, one walked across the village green and did so face to face. The telephone she tolerated, though she invariably addressed the instrument as though it were a small, particularly stupid child. Thus it occasioned a stir, if not a scandal, when Mrs. Penbury was found in her parlour on a wet Tuesday morning with the curtains drawn, a sheet of writing paper before her, and her pen poised stiffly upon the page, her body quite dead. The letter, if it may be called that, contained no more than the words, "My dearest, you must know before it is too late," after which ink blotted and trailed, as though the hand had been seized by interruption or convulsion. The village police, accustomed to the decencies of suicide notes, felt cheated. Sergeant Cribb declared that folks don't up and write cryptic messages without finishing the business. The coroner, a man of stolid digestion, thought otherwise and wagged his head over the possibility of a stroke. The vicar naturally suggested divine retribution. It was Lord Peter Whimsy, however, lounging by chance in the railway carriage where the news was breathlessly retailed to him, that pricked up his ears at the peculiar oddity. "Remarkable," he murmured, adjusting his monocle to the rain-lashed pane. "A woman who has never written a letter all her life, yet chooses her deathbed for a debut in the epistolary form. Most irregular, don't you think? A trifle like asking Bach to perform his first Charleston upon the harpsichord. Positively indecent." The other passengers, village folk in damp tweeds, blinked at him. One muttered something about Londoners, but Whimsy, quite oblivious, was already considering the matter with relish. The small absurdities of life were, he knew, often the doorways to its darkest chambers. And so, by the time the train pulled into Wrotham Holt, Lord Peter had resolved upon a stroll to Mrs. Penbury's cottage. He had no invitation, but then death seldom waited upon etiquette. The road from the Holt into East Wrotham was the colour of dishwater and made a sucking, apologetic sound at every step. One cannot hurry upon such a surface without indignity. Lord Peter, who disliked indignity even in his footwear, accepted the pace it imposed and used the time for a brief mental inventory. A woman who detested letters had sat down expressly to compose one, had managed a salutation and a sentence, and had then died, neatly, quietly, with the curtains drawn against a respectable rain. The policeman's guess at a stroke was, of course, entirely reasonable. Yet it was the reasonableness that bothered him. Nature, when she does her own work, is seldom considerate enough to provide a teasing half-communication first. The cottage, when it came into view, was precisely the sort of building in which one expects jam to be made and private judgments to be pronounced. A constable of youthful gloom presided at the gate as though sorrowing for humanity at large. He brightened at the sight of Whimsy in the way of men who recognize a diversion. "Constable," said Whimsy, and looked at the number on his collar. "Brock. How are we getting on?" "She's inside, my lord. Sergeant Cribb said as you was to have a look, if you was of a mind." "He's gone to fetch the doctor." "Excellent. That will prevent us from quarrelling about arteries." Whimsy lifted the latch and stepped into a narrow hall that smelt of beeswax, coal smoke, and old unresolved tea. The parlour lay to the right, door ajar. He paused on the threshold long enough to take in the room as a single arrangement rather than a collection of things, and then entered. Mrs. Penbury kept house as if for an unamused deity. Everything had its exact place and obediently occupied it: a rug whose pattern understood duty, a mantel clock that ticked with parliamentary persistence, a photograph of the late Mr. Penbury whose moustache conveyed the impression of never having been impertinently ruffled by life. In the armchair by the small writing table sat Mrs. Penbury herself, composed with a primness that death had not had the impertinence to disturb. The sheet of paper upon the blotter bore, in a firm schoolmistress hand, the words he had already been told: "My dearest, you must know before it is too late." Whimsy did not approach the body immediately. He went first to the window and examined the curtains. They were drawn as reported, but imprecisely. A sliver of grey day leaked between the two halves with a meagre insistence. He ran a finger along the sill. No damp. The latch stood engaged. The faintest suggestion of coal soot lay upon the interior side, which, in a cottage where the grate was lit every morning, proved nothing at all and might yet prove something if encouraged. He turned to the mantel. The clock observed him with the righteous face of an instrument used to punctuality. It indicated 12 minutes to 11 and continued to tick with smug rectitude. Whimsy set his ear to its glass briefly, then to the air of the room. From somewhere deeper in the cottage, a more elderly tick, perhaps a kitchen timepiece with opinions, kept an uneven counterpoint. "Constable," he said, "at what hour was she found?" "9:30, my lord. Mrs. Fortescue, as does for her, charwoman-like, came in and saw the curtains and the lamp and thought it odd, and then she saw, well—" He nodded unhappily toward the chair. "The lamp?" "Paraffin, my lord. Still warm when I come. I felt it, I did." "And the clock? Did you happen to notice it then?" Constable Brock looked distressed at this unreasonable request of memory. "We're ticking," he brightened. "I remember because I thought how peaceful it sounded like. After, I mean." "Peacetime is always an illusion of clocks," said Whimsy, and regarded the writing table. A small bottle of Stevens Blue Black stood with the stopper laid beside it like a conscientious mourner. The pen was steel-nibbed and clean. He lifted it, sniffed the nib, touched the tips to a scrap of paper, and obtained the faintest ghost of colour. Not freshly dipped. The letter itself did not shine as wet ink will when recently set down, and yet the blot of failing script looked, under a reasonable light, not long dried. He sat gingerly upon the corner of the table and began upon that species of ransack which leaves no mark. A glance beneath the blotter, a consideration of the waste paper basket, empty, a survey of envelopes, 2, unaddressed, a study of the paper itself. Basildon bond, respectable, with a watermark half visible when he lifted it toward the window's meagre strip. In the upper drawer, a packet of receipts tied with string, a rosary, not much worn, and a stub of wax. In the lower drawer, the usual havoc of orderly women: scissors, string, 5 buttons, 2 postage stamps, 1/2 stuck to the other, a short piece of pencil, and a little flat tin that had once contained chocolates and now contained nothing but habit. "Constable," said Whimsy, "did Mrs. Penbury keep a telephone?" "In the hall, my lord. Never used it unless she had to. Gave the operator the fidgets, they say." "Operators are easily fidgeted by people who know what they want." He moved into the hall. The black instrument sat upon a small table like an untrustworthy cat. Upon the wall hung a scribbled list of village numbers in a handwriting that had given up being elegant some time ago and was now merely authoritative. Vicarage, Dr. Hobson, Mrs. Fortescue, a penciled addition, post office, Crown and Hare. No recent smears of graphite. The pencil in the drawer would not be guilty there. He lifted the receiver and immediately replaced it. He did not want to thrill the exchange with unnecessary life before speaking to the sergeant. Back in the parlour, he looked at Mrs. Penbury at last. The face had the exasperated decency of a woman interrupted in the midst of doing something properly. He put a finger very lightly to her wrist out of regard more than hope, and then to the lamp's chimney. Still faintly warm as reported, but then paraffin lamps hold grudges against cold. He stooped to the hearth. The fire had not been laid that morning. It sat sulking in a half-spent state with no recent encouragement. A sensible widow would light her lamp if the day proved mean and her fire reluctant, and a sensible widow would draw her curtains against the draught. Yes, but the curtains would have been drawn before the lamp was lit, unless Mrs. Penbury preferred to move about in a theatrical gloom and had an unfortunate sense of timing. "Begging pardon, my lord," said Constable Brock at the door. "Mrs. Fortescue's come back. She's that upset, but she says she'll tell you anything." "Let us administer a little human tea to the facts," said Whimsy, rising. Mrs. Fortescue proved to be small, economical, and given to that specific piety which finds sin most vividly in other people's arrangements. She had the air of a woman who knows precisely how dust is made and takes it personally. Having been settled in the kitchen with a cup that would not be drunk, she told her story in a series of careful denials. "No, my lord, I didn't disturb anything. I wouldn't. I seen the curtains and the lamp, and I called up, 'Mrs. Penbury, ma'am?' And when she didn't answer, I come into the parlour, and there she was. I ran straight to the vicarage. It didn't seem decent to touch her." "You did not telephone?" Mrs. Fortescue looked horrified. "We don't have a telephone in my place. The one here, I mean." "Oh, I never use hers. She doesn't like people touching it. Said it wore the numbers out." "Ah," Whimsy smiled. "Tell me, as a charwoman of experience, at what hour would Mrs. Penbury usually draw her curtains upon a day like this?" Mrs. Fortescue bristled at the honour. "She was regular, my lord. Curtains at dusk, never in the morning, not even if it were a storm, because she said it was a sign of giving in. Fires lit after breakfast, unless the day was fine, and the lamp never, not unless she was writing a letter, which she never did, only the one for the gas man at Christmas, and I wrote that for her." "Indeed? And this morning?" "This morning she must have been taken queer, poor soul. To draw her curtains before her tea, well, it wasn't like her." "Quite." Whimsy made a small pilgrimage back to the parlour, looked again at the faint wedge of light between the curtains, and asked, as one might ask whether a spoon lived in the left-hand drawer, "Which curtain does she draw first, do you know?" Mrs. Fortescue blinked. "The left, always. Because of the ring in the rail on that side it catches." Whimsy examined the rail and found indeed a tiny imperfection. The left-hand curtain had been drawn first, to judge by the way the pleats sat. "Very good. Metaphysical certainty is not for this world, but pleats are reassuring." He asked the next irrelevant question. "What time does the mantel clock keep?" "Fast," said Mrs. Fortescue at once. 10 minutes. She likes to be early." "And the kitchen clock?" "Slow, quarter hour slow at least. I've told her, but she says it evens things out." Whimsy went to the kitchen and confirmed a cheerful lag in the cracked-faced creature ticking there. It was precisely 15 minutes behind the parlour tyrant. When he returned, Sergeant Cribb had arrived with the doctor in tow. The sergeant was broad, brisk, and wore his authority like a Sunday coat, slightly too tight across the shoulders. "Morning, my lord," said Cribb. "Bad business. Doctor says we mustn't move her yet. You've had a nosy?" "I have looked. The nose will be brought in presently." Whimsy nodded affably to Dr. Hobson, a pink man with anxieties. "Doctor, do you observe anything that gives you joy?" Not Joy, Lord Peter? She appears to have suffered a seizure. Age and weather conspire. There's a slight discoloration at the lips that might suggest, well, one doesn't like to say. One doesn't indeed, said Whimsy. Poison is such an unneighbourly word. We shall await your considered opinion. Meanwhile, Sergeant, might I trouble you to ask the exchange whether any calls were placed from this number this morning, and, for the sake of sport, last night? Cribb looked dubious. If she was writing a letter, why'd she telephone? Because people who detest letters sometimes prefer to rehearse them aloud, said Whimsy. Also because telephones provide witnesses, which letters do not. The sergeant departed muttering, and Whimsy applied himself once more to the writing table. He held the sheet very gently by the edges and tilted it again to the window. The watermark swam up obligingly. He folded the corner back upon itself with the smallest pressure, as one does to test paper's memory, and then laid it down. He glanced at the blotter. There was the clear mirror of "My dearest, you must know," and beneath dimmer ghosts of older lines, mathematical notations by the look, or shopping lists in tidy columns. Figures neatly formed, tallies perhaps. He would have to ask Mrs. Fortescue whether the blotter ever left the house. In the margin of the blotting paper, someone had idly traced the figure of an E again and again, as if practising a flourish until it satisfied. "Mrs. Fortescue," he called, "did you ever see Mrs. Penbury use this paper?" "The good paper?" "No, my lord, that's for company." "And who was company?" "She hasn't had none since 12th night. Only Mr. Henry at Michaelmas, and he never comes without wanting." "Mr. Henry?" Whimsy's ear cocked like a curious spaniel. "Her husband's nephew, lives over in Darninghoe. He's set up as an agent, insurance or wills or something clever. Very smooth." "Smoothness is a professional risk," said Whimsy. "Was he in need of money?" "All men are," said Mrs. Fortescue, with the bleak theology of experience. "But he's doing well, they say." Cribb reappeared, coat shedding raindrops. "Exchange says no calls this morning from here, my lord. One last night at 8:10. To the Crown. Hare. That's the public." "Ah," said Whimsy, gently, as if the room had just offered him a chair. "And from the Crown and Hare, did anyone ring back?" "Not to this number. Landlord says Mrs. Penbury asked for a message to be passed to someone named Mr. Emmes if he came in. He didn't." "Mr. Emmes," repeated Whimsy, trying the flavour of the name. "And does Mr. Emmes exist in East Wrotham as something other than a rumour and a pair of boots?" Cribb shrugged. "There's an Emmes at the builder's yard. Foreman. Keeps to himself. Chapel. Doesn't drink much." Pity," said Whimsy. "Piety complicates motive by removing the vulgar ones. We shall speak to him. Before that, Sergeant, have a look at the lamp. Our constable reports it warm at 9:30. The fire is not lit. The curtains were drawn before breakfast, which offends Mrs. Fortescue's theology. The mantel clock is 10 minutes fast, the kitchen clock 15 slow. The letter looks neither quite fresh nor quite stale. There is a call to the Crown and Hare at 8:10 last night, and a message for a Mr. Emmes who did not appear. Somewhere in this small symphony someone has struck a wrong note, and I'm always unhappy until I find the instrument." Cribb grunted. "Looks like a stroke to me." "My dear fellow," said Whimsy, with a courtesy that contained an amiable reproof, "if Providence had intended to conclude the matter so respectably, it would hardly have provided us with a widow who never wrote letters and persuaded her to begin one." He turned to Mrs. Fortescue once more. "When you came in, did you notice whether the pen lay in her hand or on the blotter?" "In her hand, my lord. Dropped downwards when she went. I put it down after." Ah, you put it down, and where? On the blotter, like you see. Quite right. He smiled at her as one might at a child who has unwittingly walked across a chalked diagram. And you saw no envelope addressed, no name begun? No, my lord, only them words, but who she was writing to, well, I won't be the one to say. No, said Whimsy, you have already said quite enough to be useful. There remained the business of the body, which would be the doctor's, and the business of the village, which would be everyone else's. Whimsy asked to see the larder, the back door, the little square of garden where onions stood like admonitions. The back door was bolted from within. A small smear upon the bolt, paraffin or ordinary grease. He touched it and smelled faintly the sharp clean of lamp oil. That told him only that Mrs. Penbury had maintained her household as a scrupulous sailor tends a ship. On the kitchen table lay yesterday's newspaper folded open to the births, deaths, and marriages, a neat pencil tick against nothing at all. When at last he stepped back into the parlour, he paused, not for ceremony, he had little taste for that, but for sequence. If a thing is to be understood, it must be allowed to stand where it stands before one moves it. He let the room impress itself upon him, the drawn curtains, the lamplit hush, the clock with its sly 10 minutes of superiority, the unfinished address to someone dearest, which could mean anything and usually meant nothing useful. Then he bent very slightly and addressed the late Mrs. Penbury as he might salute a formidable dowager at the end of a disputatious dinner. "Madam," he said under his breath, "you have made an exception to your rules. I am bound to follow yours before I impose any of my own." To Crib he said, in his ordinary tone, "We will speak to Mr. Emmes at the builder's yard, to the landlord of the Crown and Hare, and to Mr. Henry of Darninghoe. Also the exchange, in case Virtue has made errors in her accounts. And, Sergeant, be so good as to inquire who dusts that photograph on the mantel. If it is Mrs. Fortescue, she is diligent. If it is anybody else, I should like to know whom Mrs. Penbury permitted to put a cloth to her husband's moustache." Crib looked baffled and made a note. Whimsy, who could be very kind when he was teasing, clapped him lightly on the shoulder. "Clocks, curtains, and portraits, Sergeant. When the domestic unravels, it begins at the edges. We will tug gently and observe which threads come away in our hands." The Crown and Hare was the sort of public house which contrived to be both disreputable and respectable, depending on which door one used. Lord Peter Whimsy, arriving at the more decorous front entrance in the late afternoon drizzle, observed with a pleased eye the polished brass, the tall windows, and the discreet curtains, all of which conspired to suggest that no one of consequence had ever drunk too much behind them. At the side entrance, of course, the gravel was worn away to mud by boots less concerned with appearances, and from that quarter came the faint clang of pewter and a burst of laughter too hearty for the vicarage. Whimsy, naturally, preferred to step through the middle of contradictions and presented himself at the front bar with his hat tilted back and his manner tilted forward. The landlord, a broad fellow with a face like a comfortable loaf, looked up from polishing a glass and blinked at the monocle. "Afternoon, sir." "Weather's a bit mean." "Mean, my dear man?" "Positively parsimonious." "One expects a deluge or sunshine. This half-and-half drizzle is mere dithering." "I'll have a pint of bitter, and if you can spare me a morsel of intelligence, so much the better." The pint arrived with gravity. Whimsy sipped, looked at the foam with professional interest, and then leaned in. "You had a call last night, I believe, from Mrs. Penbury. About 8:10 by the exchange clock." The landlord nodded cautiously. "That's right. Asked me to pass a message if Mr. Emmes come in, but he didn't." "And what precise form did the message take?" Forgive the pedantry. I was brought up by a headmaster, and it left me punctilious about phrasing." The man frowned, searching his memory as though for a mislaid half-crown. She said, "Tell Mr. Emmes he must come first thing before it is too late." That's how she put it. I asked if she'd leave a name. She said he'd know. Economical? And no suggestion of what was at stake? None, sir. Sounded urgent, though. Her voice weren't like usual. Sharper. Not cross, mind you, but pressed. Pressed is excellent. It suggests both urgency and laundry. Whimsy set down his glass with approval. "Did Mr. Emmes come at all?" "Not last night, nor today, far as I've seen. He don't drink often, like I said. Keeps hisself." "Ah, yes. The sober man at the public house is a character out of Greek tragedy, always meant to be significant." Whimsy smiled pleasantly and took another sip. "Now, what do you know of Mr. Emmes?" The landlord shrugged. "Foreman at Johnson's Yard. Been there 10 year or more. Quiet sort. Lives with his sister. Don't go much to chapel nor to church. Keeps out of rows. If you asked me, I'd say he had no business with Mrs. Penbury, nor she with him." "Which is precisely why she telephones him," said Whimsy lightly. "Familiarity never motivates intrigue. It is the unlikely associations that produce music. Thank you. I will trouble you with one last question. Who else was in the bar at 8:10? "Same lot as most nights. Jenkins from the farm, the 2 Wetherell brothers, and old Miss Cottle, who comes for her port. They'll all tell you she didn't say more than what I told you." Miss Cottle. Delightful. Every bar requires a dowager to keep the men from lapsing into pure monotony. Whimsy drained his glass, left the appropriate coin with exaggerated ceremony, and went out. Sergeant Cribb, waiting in the motor with the resigned air of a man who suspects he is about to be led in circles, asked, "Well?" "Well, indeed," said Whimsy, settling himself with languid ease. "We must next apply ourselves to the elusive Mr. Emmes, who has succeeded in being absent at precisely the right moment. Nothing damns a man so much as failing to appear when he is expected." They drove to Johnson's Yard, a place of timber, sawdust, and men in shirt-sleeves who looked as if they had been cut out of the wood themselves. A heavy scent of pitch and rain hung over the place. The foreman, when summoned, proved to be a long, angular man with a face like a weathered post and a voice that had learned economy from his sores. "Emmes," he said, wiping his hands. "That's me. What can I do?" "Lord Peter Whimsy," said Whimsy cheerfully, "dabbling in the affairs of widows. We're told you were expected at Mrs. Penbury's last night, and did not arrive. Most unkind of you." The man looked startled, then stiffened. "I had no appointment with her." "Ah, then she was mistaken. She telephoned the Crown and Hare to say you must come before it was too late. Rather theatrical, don't you think? Almost Shakespearean." Emmes frowned. "I don't know what she meant. I've done jobs for her, mending her fence, setting a new beam in the shed. But I'd no business last night." "Business? Perhaps not. But some communication was intended. Tell me, Mr. Emmes, did you know her well?" "Not well. She was particular, like all of 'em. Paid proper. Wanted things done just so, that's all. No personal exchanges, no confidences about nephews, legacies, or the virtues of lamps." Emmes shook his head, though his eyes flickered briefly at the word nephew. Whimsy noted it, as one notes a cat that twitches when a mouse is mentioned. "She was a hard woman," Emmes said. "Kept to herself. Wouldn't take nonsense. I respected that." "Respect is a dangerous form of intimacy," said Whimsy. "One begins by admiring punctuality and ends by writing wills." He gave the man a cordial nod. "If anything comes to you, anything at all, you will remember that truth is like sawdust. It gets everywhere, however one tries to sweep it out." They left him looking wooden and drove on. Cribb growled, "You think he's lying?" I think he's holding back a truth that embarrasses him, which is not quite the same as lying. Lying requires invention. He had none, he merely omitted. Then who was she writing to? Ah, that is the delicious point. My dearest is an uncommonly extravagant beginning for a woman who detested paper. To whom could she have said it? Nephew Henry? The austere Mr. Emmes, or someone else altogether? A correspondent who expected a letter, not a visit. He smiled. We must see, Henry, relatives are the natural weeds of an inheritance. That afternoon they motored the 5 miles to Darninghoe, where Mr. Henry Penbury had established himself in an office between a solicitor and a confectioner, thereby advertising both legality and comfort. He was a smooth man in a smooth suit, with hair that believed in brilliantine and a smile that aspired to insurance. He rose eagerly when Whimsy entered, then checked himself at the sight of Cribb's uniform. "Mr. Henry Penbury," said Whimsy, "we come about your aunt." Henry arranged his features into proper melancholy. "Poor old soul, I had word this morning. Quite a shock. Was it peaceful?" "As peaceful as one may be when interrupted by a letter," said Whimsy, dryly. "You have not heard the details, then? Number only that she was found in her chair. Was it her heart?" "Possibly, but she left behind a fragment of writing. That is curious, you see, because she never wrote. You will forgive me if I ask bluntly, did she ever write to you?" Henry looked honestly astonished. "Never. She always sent word by Mrs. Fortescue or by a note dictated to someone else. I had letters from her, but I always knew they weren't in her hand." "Then she did not consider you dearest?" "I beg your pardon?" "Nothing," said Whimsy, smiling. "Tell me, Mr. Penbury, did you see her recently?" 3 weeks ago I went to discuss some investments. She was cautious. She liked to keep her money where she could see it, in land and bonds. I thought she might alter her will, but she said she would never change a word until she died." "Ah, the true Englishwoman. Constancy to a document." Whimsy regarded him with bland interest. "And you would naturally inherit?" Henry coloured faintly. "As her nearest relation, yes. But I assure you, Lord Peter, I never desired her death." "My dear fellow, desiring death and profiting by it are two separate amusements. Still, you will not object if we examine the matter?" Henry hesitated, then leaned forward earnestly. "You must understand she had enemies, not in the ordinary sense, but people resented her. She was stern. The villagers muttered. I wouldn't put it past one of them to wish her harm." "Villagers mutter because silence is too conspicuous," said Whimsy. "But resentment rarely produces letters. I thank you for your candour. You will allow me to trouble you again, no doubt." As they left, Cribb muttered, "He looked shifty." Smooth men always look shifty. It is the Polish. One expects to slip. But note, he mentioned the will before we asked. That is a kind of reflex in heirs, like wagging in dogs. Still, he may be entirely innocent. Innocence often explains itself too quickly. The rain had ceased, leaving the evening heavy and damp. Whimsy stood a moment on the pavement, hat tilted, breathing the smell of wet brick and horse dung. He looked amused, which was a sign that he was beginning to enjoy himself. "Sergeant," he said, "we have a widow who never wrote letters, a nephew who mentions wills, a foreman who denies an appointment, and a publican who swears to urgency. The clocks run both fast and slow. The lamp burns when it should not, and the curtains disobey their mistress's rule. What does it mean?" Cribb sighed. "That something's queer, my lord. Precisely, something's queer. And when life becomes queer, death usually explains it. We must only find the right question to ask the right person in the wrong place. For now, let us return to East Wrotham and see whether Mrs. Fortescue has remembered something she has not yet told us." And with that, Whimsy climbed back into the motor, humming a scrap of Mozart as though death and letters and secrets were but another form of divertimento. The return to East Wrotham carried with it that peculiar hush villages acquire after a death, as though the hedgerows themselves felt obliged to whisper. Whimsy, who disliked whispering on principle, countered it by whistling a fragment of Mozart until Crib threatened mutiny. He broke off with an amiable shrug and said, "It is an extraordinary thing, Sergeant, how the English countryside contrives to look most innocent precisely when it is most guilty. The fields may be honest, but the people seldom are." They pulled up again outside Mrs. Penbury's cottage, where the lamps had been lit, and a small knot of villagers loitered at what they considered a respectful distance. The cottage, with its curtains once more drawn, looked both reproachful and theatrical, as if resenting the intrusion of strangers upon its final performance. Mrs. Fortescue was waiting in the kitchen, stiff with fatigue, but determined to be useful. Her hands were reddened from some unnecessary scouring of the sink, and her eyes were bright with the indignation of a woman whose settled routine had been disturbed. "You're back, my lord," she said. "I've been thinking, and there's something I may not have said." "Delightful," said Whimsy, hanging up his hat with the air of a man settling into an armchair. "I adore afterthoughts. They are invariably more accurate than first impressions, which are too concerned with making themselves look tidy. What have you remembered?" Mrs. Fortescue hesitated. "It's only that when I came in yesterday morning, the clock on the mantel weren't chiming right. It struck 1:15 when it should have been 1:45. "Ah!" Whimsy's eyes gleamed. "And yet it still displayed 10 minutes fast?" "Yes, my lord, but the chime was wrong. I thought maybe I imagined it." "One never imagines clocks. They are far too opinionated. This is most useful." "Thank you." He turned to Crib. "Sergeant, we must consider whether our late widow's clocks were accomplices or victims." Crib grunted. "All this about clocks, when what difference does it make?" "My dear fellow, time is the one accomplice who cannot be bribed, only misreported. When people try to cheat time, they always leave fingerprints. Speaking of which, did you obtain anything from the exchange?" Crib consulted his notes. "No calls made this morning, as we said. The operator swears the one last night went out at 8:10 exactly. No reply expected back." "Very good. Now, Mrs. Fortescue, a final trifle. Did you notice whether the back door was bolted when you came in?" "Yes, my lord. I had to unbolt it myself when I left. She always did it before bed." "Which means the house was closed from the inside. Yet she attempted to summon Mr. Emmes. Curious, almost as though she expected him to come by some other entrance, or not at all." Whimsy smiled benignly at her, then excused her to her tea, leaving Crib looking exasperated. In the parlour the atmosphere had changed. Death, when first discovered, leaves a room raw, but after a day it begins to settle, as if the furniture adjusts itself to the new arrangement. Whimsy stood before the writing table once more, peering down at the solitary sentence. He traced the words lightly in the air with one finger. "My dearest, you must—" "Know before it is too late." He murmured them aloud, testing their cadence, as though he were weighing a line of verse. "Sergeant, you observe that she did not address the note by name. She could have written 'My dear Henry' or 'My dear Mr. Emmes.' She did not. She wrote 'My dearest,' a phrase intimate, almost romantic, but not necessarily so. It could mean a lover, but it could also mean a person to whom she owed a final confession. It is deliberately vague." "Or she hadn't decided what name to put," Crib suggested. "Precisely. Indecision is the most revealing of conditions. People betray themselves most in hesitation, not in action." At that moment the door creaked, and Constable Brock shuffled in with a nervous expression. "Begging your pardon, my lord, but there's a man asking for you, says his name's Emmes. He's in the kitchen." "Splendid!" cried Whimsy, rubbing his hands as though offered a new dessert. The reluctant foreman has developed a conscience, or curiosity, let us see which. Emmes looked even more wooden than before, his clothes damp with evening mist. He stood stiffly by the kitchen hearth, his cap in his hands, and regarded Whimsy with the awkward defiance of a man who has come unwillingly but cannot stay away. "I thought I'd best come," he said slowly. "I didn't want folks to think I was hiding." "Excellent instinct," said Whimsy. "Confession may be good for the soul, but explanation is better for the police. Sit down, Mr. Emmes, and tell us why Mrs. Penbury summoned you." Emmes shifted uneasily. "I told you? I don't know. She never said nothing to me direct." "But she left a message for you at the Crown and Hare. That is an undeniable fact. She expected you urgently. Now, why should she do so if you had no understanding with her?" "I can't say. She was particular, as I said. Maybe she wanted me to mend something." "At night, before it was too late?" Whimsy raised his brows. "A most unusual hour for carpentry." The man flushed. "I didn't ask her for no meetings, my lord. She was respectable, and so am I." "Of course. Respectability is an excellent alibi, though it seldom convinces the coroner. Let me ask instead, what did you see the last time you visited her?" Emmes frowned, considering. "I fixed a beam in the shed last month." She spoke of her nephew. "Said he was always after her about her money. She didn't hold with it. Said she'd rather burn it than give it over. Delightful sentiment. One almost hopes she carried it out. But tell me, did she mention a will?" "She said she wouldn't change it, whatever he said. I didn't know what she meant. I didn't want to." "And yet you remember it distinctly. Thank you, that is all for now. Only do not stray too far, Mr. Emmes. The village is small, but gossip travels quicker than legs." After he had gone, Cribb muttered, "He's hiding."
"Something, I'll warrant it's about money." "Undoubtedly," said Whimsy, cheerfully. "But whether it is her money or his honesty remains to be seen. Observe, however, that he remembers the nephew. That is twice now. Henry has been introduced to us without solicitation. Men who are innocent of ambition rarely attract so much testimony." They dined that evening at the vicarage, where the Reverend Pottle entertained them with solemn platitudes and an overboiled stew. Whimsy endured both with good humour, diverting himself by quoting Horace under his breath and teasing the vicar's wife about her choice of curtains. Yet all the while his mind was turning over the curious sequence: the mis-striking clock, the lamp, the bolted doors, the nephew, and the missing Mr. Emmes. A puzzle, yes, but more than that, a puzzle that had been arranged for an audience. Mrs. Penbury had meant her message to be found. Later, back at the inn where he was lodged, Whimsy sat by the fire with a glass of port and a notebook. He wrote a list. Widow never wrote letters. Why begin now? Curtains drawn at wrong hour. Lamp lit without fire. Mantel clock chimes wrong. Kitchen clock contradicts it. Nephew Henry too smooth, too eager. Emmes summoned but did not come. Letter fragment, ambiguous. He tapped the pen against his teeth. "The difficulty, old boy," he murmured to himself, "is not the facts but the order of them. Somewhere the sequence has been rearranged, and when time is rearranged, murder is never far behind." The fire crackled, shadows danced, and Whimsy allowed himself a small, ironic smile. The village thought itself cloaked in grief and silence, but to him it was already alive with contradictions, and contradictions, he knew, were the surest heralds of truth. The question was only which clock, which person, which lie would betray itself first. And with that thought he leaned back, closed his eyes for a moment, and let the village clocks tick themselves into his dreams. Morning broke in East Wrotham with the obstinate cheerfulness of sparrows who refused to be cowed by tragedy. Whimsy, who had been awake since 6, was already strolling the village green with his hat set at a rakish angle, a cigarette dangling at the corner of his mouth, and his monocle firmly in place. He liked to see a village by daylight after it had been darkened by death. It was rather like looking at a theatre set with the stage lights turned up. One could see the paint, the patched curtains, the careful artifice that had appeared so convincing under gloom. At 7:30, he presented himself again at Mrs. Penbury's cottage, where Constable Brock looked sleepier than the sparrows. The constable reported that Sergeant Cribb had gone to speak with the coroner. Whimsy, entirely unbothered, invited himself in and seated himself before the mantel clock. He listened to it tick with an air of exaggerated gravity, as though the clock were attempting to confess something. "Poor fellow," he said aloud, "too conscientious by half, strikes quarters it hasn't reached, pretends to accuracy it doesn't possess, and yet people trust clocks. That's where they fail." He scribbled a note on his cuff, and then went out into the garden, where the dew was still sharp upon the cabbages. Mrs. Fortescue, of course, was already there, tying up beans with an air of battle. She looked up at him with the kind of reproach that only lifelong respectability can produce. "I thought you'd be off back to London by now, my lord." "London is all very well for noise, but it does nothing for clocks, Mrs. Fortescue. One must come to the countryside for proper temporal dishonesty." She gave him a puzzled frown, then sniffed. "If you ask me, you should be speaking with Mr. Henry, always nosing about her affairs. She said to me once he was the only one who'd make trouble when she was gone." Whimsy's monocle gleamed. "Indeed? And what form did this promised trouble take?" "She didn't say, only that he was smooth and never stopped asking questions about her papers. I told her she'd best lock them up." Which she did, admirably. "But then she wrote one." "Dear me, Mrs. Fortescue, your mistress was far too consistent for my comfort. She must have meant us to notice the inconsistency." He left her to her beans, and returned indoors to await Cribb, who soon arrived, blowing into his moustache like a disgruntled trumpet. "Doctor says likely a seizure," the sergeant began, "though he won't rule out poison until he's seen the stomach." "Doctors," said Whimsy, "never rule anything out. They merely leave it lying about like an umbrella, ready to be picked up later. But what did the coroner say?" "That he'd hold an inquest tomorrow, wants a proper post-mortem." "Good. Inquests are delicious things. They provide one with an audience." Cribb, unimpressed, flung himself into a chair. "What now?" "Now," said Whimsy serenely, "we test chronology. Our clocks, our lamps, our letters, everything depends upon time. We must ask the villagers to account for theirs." And so they began, a slow, methodical walk through East Wrotham, stopping at cottages, shops and farms. Whimsy asked questions that appeared trivial. "What hour did you see Mrs. Penbury last? Did you hear the clock strike? Did you notice her curtains? Did she buy lamp oil last week?" Cribb took notes with a look of despair, for most answers were negative or vague. But then came a glimmer. Old Miss Cottle, encountered hobbling to the post office, declared that she had seen Mrs. Penbury's curtains, drawn already when she passed at 8:30 the previous evening. "Sure of it, ma'am?" asked Whimsy lightly. "Of course I'm sure. I never forget curtains. They tell you more about a household than any talk. Drawn at 8:30, and her lamp shining too. I said to myself, the widow's gone queer at last." Whimsy bowed as though she had offered him the key to a kingdom. "You are a woman of true perception." "Thank you," Cribb muttered. "Well, that proves nothing." "On the contrary," said Whimsy, "it proves everything. It proves the curtains were drawn last night, not in the morning, which directly contradicts Mrs. Fortescue. Either the charwoman is mistaken, or something more artful is at play. In any case, the chronology totters delicious." By midday, they turned their attention once more to Henry. Summoned to the cottage, he arrived with proper solemnity and a black armband that looked as though it had been applied with theatrical speed. Whimsy greeted him with exaggerated courtesy. "Mr. Henry, we must trouble you with a few more questions. First, did you telephone your aunt last night?" "Certainly not." Henry looked affronted. "I was at home." "Alone?" "Well, yes." "How improving. Solitude is always such an accommodating alibi. And tell me, did your aunt ever speak to you of Mr. Emmes?" Henry frowned. "Once or twice. She said he was dependable. Why?" "Because she summoned him, urgently, and he did not come. I rather think she expected him to bear witness to something. Perhaps she meant to disclose a truth inconvenient to someone else, perhaps to you." "That's absurd," Henry snapped. "I had nothing to fear from her. She always intended me to inherit. Everyone knew it." "Ah, but wills, Mr. Henry, are treacherous documents. They sit like fat spiders in drawers, and then, with a single stroke of the pen, they scuttle away in another direction. Did you ever see her will?" "Number. She never showed it to me." "Precisely. And yet you are certain of its contents. A most remarkable faith. I wish I could believe in Shakespeare editions with the same conviction." Henry flushed again and demanded to be excused. Whimsy let him go with a courteous bow, watching him stalk down the lane with stiff shoulders. "That one's hiding something," said Cribb darkly. "They are all hiding something, Sergeant. That is what makes villages so amusing. But the important thing is not what they hide, it is whether their secrets keep time." The afternoon was spent examining the practical details. Whimsy inspected the back gate, tested the latch on the shed, even measured the distance from the cottage to the Crown and Hare. He timed his own steps, counted the minutes, and scrawled figures on scraps of paper. By 5 o'clock, Cribb's patience was frayed beyond repair. "All this measuring!" he burst out. "You've walked up and down the same lane 6 times. What does it prove?" "That the human foot is more reliable than the human tongue," said Whimsy calmly. "If Mrs. Penbury telephoned at 8:10, and her curtains were observed drawn at 8:30, and her lamp was lit before 9, then the sequence admits of only 2 explanations. Either she was preparing for
someone's visit, or someone was arranging appearances after she no longer could." "Which is more likely, Sergeant?" Cribb stared. "You mean she was killed before she wrote that letter? Or perhaps she wrote it much earlier, and someone contrived to make it seem later. In either case, the clocks, the lamp, the curtains, all conspire against simplicity. Death by seizure is tidy. This is not tidy. Therefore it is murder." He said it with quiet certainty, not as drama but as an observation, as if remarking upon the weather. Cribb swallowed and looked toward the darkening cottage windows. "And who?" he asked hoarsely. Whimsy smiled faintly. "Ah, that is the dessert course. First we must eat the meat. We shall wait upon the inquest tomorrow. There will be slips, there always are, and when the chronology has betrayed itself, the culprit will follow." As the evening bells tolled across East Wrotham, Whimsy strolled back toward the inn, humming cheerfully. The village might be mourning, but to him it was alive with riddles, each tick of the clock whispering that truth, though delayed, was inevitable. The inquest was convened the next morning in the draughty assembly room above the post office, a chamber where the scent of sealing wax and penny stamps clung obstinately to the rafters. The villagers packed the benches with the avid gloom of those who relish other people's misfortunes, provided they are sufficiently genteel. Whimsy arrived 10 minutes early, which was to say precisely on time by his own fastidious reckoning, and settled himself in a corner where he could observe both witness box and audience. Sergeant Cribb, looking pugnacious in his Sunday best, leaned against the wall like a man determined not to be surprised.
The coroner, Mr. Blenkinsop, presided with the air of one who considered death less an event than a breach of regulations. He cleared his throat portentously, read the preliminary facts, and then called the first witness, Mrs. Fortescue. The charwoman climbed into the box with the piety of one ascending a pulpit. She gave her evidence in tones of injured virtue, recounting how she had found the curtains drawn, the lamp lit, and Mrs. Penbury in her chair with the unfinished letter. "You are certain," asked the coroner, "that the curtains were drawn when you arrived at 9:30? "Yes, sir, certain. I thought it odd, but I never touched them." "And the lamp?" "Lit and warm, sir. I felt it." Whimsy shifted in his seat and made a little scribble in his notebook. The coroner, oblivious, dismissed her, and next came Constable Brock. His testimony was brief and embarrassed. He confirmed the position of the body, the condition of the room, and the time of his arrival. "Did you observe the clock upon the mantel?" asked Blenkinsop. "Yes, sir. It said 12 minutes to 11. The coroner frowned. "But this was 9:30. "Yes, sir. It's fast like." "Thank you. That will be all." The village stirred with a ripple of whispers. Whimsy smiled faintly. The clock had performed its trick once more, striking notes out of tune with the hour. Next came the landlord of the Crown and Hare, who confirmed the telephone call. "She asked me to tell Mr. Emmes to come at once, before it was too late. That was her very words." "And what did you understand her to mean?" "Sounded urgent, sir. I thought maybe someone was ill." "Did Mr. Emmes appear?" "No, sir, never." Emmes himself was then called, long and stiff in his Sunday coat. He admitted he had done occasional work for Mrs. Penbury, but denied any appointment that night. "You had no expectation of seeing her?" "No, sir, none." The coroner's thin lips pursed. "Then why should she summon you?" "I don't know." He stood, dogged and silent, refusing to embroider. The villagers muttered again, half convinced of his guilt by his very plainness. Whimsy, however, twirled his monocle and looked amused. Finally, Henry Penbury took the stand, smooth and solicitous, every inch the dutiful nephew. He spoke of his aunt's eccentricity, her dislike of letters, her caution with money. He insisted she had always intended him to inherit, though she would never show him the will. "Did she ever speak of altering it?" asked Blenkinsop. "She told me she would not. She said it was settled. And yet she wrote a letter on the night she died." Henry's face worked faintly. "If she did, I can't explain it." The coroner leaned back, satisfied with his parade of facts. "In my opinion," he declared, "this was a natural death, probably a seizure. No evidence of violence, no proof of poison, and no motive apparent. I shall return a verdict accordingly." There was a collective sigh, half relief and half disappointment. But at that moment Whimsy rose very politely, as though excusing himself at a dinner table. "Forgive me, Mr. Coroner, but might I be permitted a question?" Blenkinsop, startled, hesitated. "You are Lord Peter Whimsy, I believe?" "Very well. One question." "Thank you. Mrs. Fortescue, when you found Mrs. Penbury, was the pen still in her hand?" The charwoman blinked. "Yes, my lord. Dropped down after. I laid it on the blotter. Precisely, and you will recall the words upon the page. My dearest, you must know before it is too late. The ink, was it dry when you saw it?" She frowned. "It looked dry, yes. I don't recall a smear." "Excellent, which means it had been written some time before her death, not in the moment of collapse. If she had died mid-sentence, the ink would have been wet. Therefore the letter is not her final act, but something earlier, deliberately left." The room rustled. The coroner frowned. Cribb looked as if someone had dropped a hedgehog into his hat. Whimsy continued gently. "One more trifle. The mantel clock, you say, read 12 minutes to 11 at 9:30. Mrs. Fortescue, you noticed it struck the wrong quarter, did you not?
Yes, my lord. And clearly it had been tampered with. And why? Because time is our only witness, and someone wished to confuse it. The coroner coughed. This is most irregular. Most irregular indeed, said Whimsy, bowing. That is why it is important. Gentlemen, ladies, the evidence is consistent not with natural death, but with an elaborate rearrangement of appearances. Mrs. Penbury did not die peacefully of a seizure. She was murdered, and her murder staged about her with lamps, curtains, and clocks to deceive us. Gasps filled the room. Henry Penbury went pale. Emmes stared fixedly at the floor. Whimsy, satisfied, sat down again with perfect calm. The coroner spluttered, declared that further investigation must be made, and adjourned. The villagers spilled out into the street, buzzing like bees disturbed in their hive. Cribb caught Whimsy by the elbow. "My lord, if you knew this, why didn't you say before?" "Because, my dear fellow, one must always allow the performance to reach its climax before one applauds. Had I spoken yesterday, we should have been left without drama. Now we have intrigue." They walked together down the lane. "But who?" asked Cribb low. "Who indeed?" "Consider. Henry inherits, yet proclaims it too quickly. Emmes is summoned, yet does not come. The charwoman insists upon curtains and lamps, yet misremembers the order. Each has his lie, small or large. Which lie aligns with the false clocks? That is what we must discover." They returned to the inn, where Whimsy ordered tea and a plate of scones, as if nothing were amiss. He sat at the window, watching the villagers' heads bob along the street, and spoke with quiet relish. "You see, Sergeant, murder is never the blow but the cover-up. Anyone can strike a fatal stroke. It is the rearrangement afterwards, the curtains, the lamp, the clock, that betrays the hand. This murderer has been painstaking, but never quite painstaking enough. We have but to wait, tug a few more threads, and the whole fabric will unravel." He sipped his tea delicately, then smiled with the satisfaction of a man who has heard the first bars of a symphony and already knows how it must end. The village of East Wrotham had seldom known such excitement as it enjoyed that afternoon. By the time Lord Peter and Sergeant Cribb had finished their tea, half the parish had convinced itself that Mrs. Penbury had been strangled with a rosary, while the other half was sure she had drunk poison delivered in a teapot. Whimsy, who appreciated gossip as one appreciates a badly tuned fiddle, interesting only when one knows the melody it ought to be playing, strolled contentedly along the lane toward the churchyard, where silence was more reliable than chatter. He paused by the lich gate and regarded the gravestones with the air of a man checking citations in a library. "Remarkable things. Tombstones," he said. "Every inscription a lie, every date a puzzle. One could solve half the crimes in England by comparing epitaphs with parish registers. Look there, beloved husband and father, taken suddenly in the prime of life, aged 72. If 72 is the prime of life, I'm a fishmonger." Cribb, trudging beside him with the air of a man whose boots had never quite dried, muttered, "You've a queer way of thinking, my lord." "What's tombstones got to do with murder?" "Everything, Sergeant. Tombstones record how people wished to be remembered, not how they lived. Murder is precisely the same, an attempt to rewrite a life at its conclusion. Our Mrs. Penbury has been granted a most improbable epilogue. She never wrote letters, and yet she died in the act of writing one, too theatrical by half." They turned down the path toward the vicarage, where the Reverend Pottle was said to keep his ear more sharply tuned to village scandal than to his own sermons. The vicar received them in his study, cluttered with volumes that looked as though they had been scolded into staying put upon the shelves. He was a thin man with watery eyes and a cough that seemed to have been cultivated for sympathy. "My dear Lord Peter," he began with fluttering hands, "such a tragedy, such a trial for our poor flock.
Mrs. Penbury was a tower of rectitude. "A tower that toppled in her armchair," said Whimsy. "Tell me, Vicar, did she ever confide in you regarding her soul or her will?" The vicar winced slightly at the juxtaposition. "She was not one to indulge in confidences, my lord. She came to service, she paid her pew rent, she criticised the hymns, and she went home. As to her will, she once said she preferred to speak to her solicitor rather than to the Almighty about such things." "Practical woman," murmured Whimsy. "And did she speak to you of her nephew?" "Ah, Henry, a very attentive relation, somewhat eager perhaps, but surely nothing amiss in that." "Still she hinted once, only once, that he pressed her unduly about altering certain provisions. She did not take kindly to being pressed." "Pressed," repeated Whimsy, his monocle glinting. "The very word the landlord used about her tone on the telephone. Interesting, don't you think?" The vicar coughed and looked nervous, as though afraid of having blasphemed. Whimsy thanked him with exaggerated courtesy, and the two men returned to the lane. "Sergeant," he said, "the case grows more melodious by the moment. Everyone sings the same refrain. Henry and the will, Emmes and the missing appointment, the letter that is too ambiguous to be genuine. We must find the false note." That evening, they visited Emmes again at his sister's cottage on the edge of the village. The man greeted them with visible reluctance, standing squarely in the doorway as though barring entry to unwelcome tradesmen. His sister, a severe woman with sharp elbows and sharper eyes, hovered behind him. "You again?" Emmes said flatly. "Yes, indeed," said Whimsy, breezing past him into the narrow parlour without waiting for an invitation. "We enjoyed your evidence at the inquest, but it left us unsatisfied. You see, Mr. Emmes, truth is a very demanding guest. It requires more than one course at dinner. Tell me, why did Mrs. Penbury wish to see you before it was too late?" "I've told you I don't know." "Permit me to suggest otherwise. You see, she had written a letter, unfinished alas, which began with the words, 'My dearest, you must know before it is too late.' A curious coincidence of phrasing, don't you think?" Emmes shifted uncomfortably. His sister's lips thinned. "I had nothing to do with her letter," he said harshly. "Perhaps not," said Whimsy softly. "But she thought you would understand it. That is why she summoned you. I wonder what secret you share with the widow who never wrote letters?" The silence thickened. At last the sister broke it with a sharp laugh. "Secrets? Don't be ridiculous. He's a working man. He's got no secrets with widows." Whimsy bowed slightly. "Then I beg your pardon. Only, if a secret does exist, it will reveal itself, as all secrets do. Good evening." He left them gaping and walked away down the dark lane, humming again. Crib caught him up, growling, "Why didn't you press harder?" "He knows something." "Of course he does," said Whimsy cheerfully. "But pressing a man too hard before he is ready only produces lies. Far better to leave him to stew. He will blurt the truth soon enough, to relieve himself of the flavour." Back at the inn, Whimsy sat with his notebook again, arranging times and contradictions. The telephone call at 8:10, the curtains drawn by 8:30. The lamp lit though the fire was cold, the mantel clock wrong, the kitchen clock contrary. The letter written earlier than her death, yet staged as if written at the last moment. He considered each item as though placing pieces on a chessboard. "The murderer," he murmured, "is like a clumsy composer. He has written a symphony in which the violins enter too soon and the trumpets too late. All I must do is follow the score until the discord reveals itself." Crib, watching him, muttered, "You think it was Henry?" "I think Henry is convenient," said Whimsy. "Too convenient. He waves his inheritance like a flag. It might be true, but it is too obvious. Murderers seldom parade their motives so openly." "Then Emmes?" "Perhaps, but again, too stark a figure." No, Sergeant. The real hand may be hidden in plain sight, disguised by simplicity. The trick lies in the timing, and tomorrow we shall reconstruct it. The next morning dawned sharp and bright, as though determined to sweep away all mystery with sunlight. Whimsy was up early, commanding Crib, Brock, and a reluctant Mrs. Fortescue to assemble in the Penbury parlour. He stood before them with the energy of a stage manager calling rehearsal. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are about to play a little drama. We shall reset the room as it was found, curtains drawn, lamp lit, letter on the table, clock on the mantel. Then we shall observe what cannot possibly have been true." Mrs. Fortescue sniffed, but obeyed, tugging the curtains across. Whimsy himself lit the lamp and placed it upon the table. The room was plunged into a murky glow, oppressive in the morning light. "Now," said Whimsy, "consider. If Mrs. Penbury truly sat down to write at 9 in the morning, why would she draw her curtains and light her lamp when the day was clear? Nonsense. Therefore it must have been evening. And if evening, why does the letter appear dry and settled by morning? Because it was written earlier still. Someone arranged this tableau to suggest she died while writing, but she did not." Crib scratched his head. "Then when did she die?" "Ah, that is the music still waiting to be played. But look at the clock. If it was tampered with, as it must have been, then the time of death could be shifted earlier or later to suit the alibi of the guilty party. That is the heart of it, the manipulation of time." The charwoman shivered. "You mean she was already dead when I found her?" "Yes, Mrs. Fortescue, she was already dead, and someone had set the scene for you to find. That is why you noticed what you did. The curtains, the lamp, the pen, they were clues, though you did not know it." The woman crossed herself and muttered a prayer. Crib looked grim. Whimsy, however, smiled with that peculiar lightness he reserved for the darkest moments. "We have almost enough," he said softly. "A few more questions, a few more contradictions, and then the symphony will resolve into its final chord. Until then, patience. Murder, like music, must be played to the end before one applauds." And with that, he extinguished the lamp, flung open the curtains, and let the morning pour in, a flood of light upon a room still steeped in shadows. The following day broke with a low mist crawling over the hedgerows, the kind of weather that encouraged secrets to linger. Whimsy, who found mist most accommodating for detective work, it softened outlines much as lies softened alibis, was already at Mrs. Penbury's cottage before most of East Wrotham had lit their kettles. He had summoned Henry Penbury and Mr. Emmes there, along with Mrs. Fortescue, under the polite but immovable suggestion that their presence was required. The three arrived in varying states of indignation. Henry was sleek but uneasy, his black armband now fraying at the edges. Emmes stood square-jawed and sullen, as if carved out of his own timber yard. Mrs. Fortescue bustled in with the air of a woman prepared to endure martyrdom, if only she might supervise the cleaning afterwards. Sergeant Crib planted himself at the door, arms folded. Whimsy, leaning languidly against the writing-table with the fatal letter before him, looked like a conductor about to summon an orchestra. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, monocle glinting, "you are wondering why I have troubled you so indecently early. It is because murder is a punctual business, and we must oblige it by keeping time. We have, you see, a most obliging victim, a widow who detested letters, who nevertheless arranged to die in the act of writing one. The scene was so obliging, in fact, that it could not possibly be true. Therefore, we must reenact it." Henry shifted. "This is absurd, Lord Peter. The coroner has already given his verdict." "Which," said Whimsy pleasantly, was as incorrect as a hymn sung off-key. Permit me to demonstrate. Mrs. Fortescue, would you be so good as to take your accustomed place as though you had entered the room at 9:30 yesterday morning?" The charwoman, muttering about indecency, stood hesitantly in the doorway. Whimsy moved to the mantel clock, adjusted it to 12 minutes before 11, and allowed it to tick in its false superiority. He then drew the curtains and lit the lamp, plunging the room into its contrived gloom. "Observe," he said, "this is what Mrs. Fortescue found. Curtains drawn, lamp lit, clock wrong, and the widow seated with pen in hand. Very affecting, very dramatic. But it is impossible. Why? Because the ink upon the page was already dry. She had written those words earlier, left them, and someone returned later to place them before her. Therefore the scene was staged," Emmes muttered. "Staged by who?" "Ah," said Whimsy, "that is precisely the question. Let us consider. Mrs. Penbury telephoned the Crown and Hare at 8:10, leaving a message for you, Mr. Emmes, to come before it is too late. At 8:30, Miss Cottle saw her curtains already drawn and her lamp burning. At 9:30, Mrs. Fortescue discovered her dead. Between these times, the stage was set. Now who could have done it? Henry flushed angrily. "You cannot mean me. I was nowhere near the cottage last night." "On the contrary," said Whimsy, "you had every reason to be here. Your aunt had resolved to make some alteration to her will, or at least to announce her intention of doing so. You pressed her once too often, and she determined to leave a record. That is why she wrote the opening words of a letter, not to you, but to another. My dearest, you must know before it is too late. She intended to tell Mr. Emmes, whose plain honesty she trusted, precisely what you were about. But she never finished. She was silenced." Henry leapt to his feet. "That is slanderous. You cannot prove a word of it." Whimsy held up a hand. "Calm yourself. I did not say you killed her. I said you had motive, but opportunity. That depends upon time. If you were at Darninghoe at 8 o'clock, could you be here by 8:20? Easily by motor. Could you slip in, tamper with the clock, draw the curtains, and depart? Quite. But so could another. Mr. Emmes, for example, had only to walk across the fields. Why, then, did he not appear at the Crown and Hare when summoned? That is the question that gnaws." Emmes glowered. "Because I had no business with her. I wasn't going to be dragged into her quarrels with her nephew." "Aha!" cried Whimsy softly. "So you admit there were quarrels. Excellent. Every quarrel is a clue, disguised as conversation. You see, gentleman and lady Mrs. Penbury was not beloved. She was feared, respected, resented. Her death suited more than one person. But her last letter, unfinished though it is, was meant for someone. Not Henry, who expected her bounty, not Emmes, who dreaded her entanglements. Who then? The silence grew heavy. Mrs. Fortescue's hands twisted in her apron. Whimsy turned his monocle upon her with devastating politeness. "My dear Mrs. Fortescue, perhaps you can enlighten us. You are a woman of precision. You notice curtains, lamps, clocks. Tell us, who dusted the photograph of Mr. Penbury on the mantel?" She started. Why, I did, of course." "Always you?" Her eyes flickered. "Sometimes she did herself." "And did anyone else ever touch it?" She hesitated. "Number never." Whimsy's voice softened as though coaxing a frightened child. "You see, that photograph bears a curious film upon it, not of dust, but of lamp soot, recent and uneven. Someone placed the lamp too near it, someone who did not know her exact arrangements, that someone staged the scene, and who was first in the room before the police. Why, you, Mrs. Fortescue." She flushed crimson. "Me? You can't mean I found her, that's all. I'd never harm her." "I don't say you harmed her," said Whimsy,
But you adjusted the scene, perhaps at another's bidding, perhaps out of panic. You moved the pen, you noticed the blotter, you touched the lamp. Small things, yes, but enough to obscure the true time of her death. Cribb broke in roughly. Then when did she die, my lord? Earlier, said Whimsy gravely. Much earlier, before the telephone call. The message was given not by her, but by another using her name. That explains why the landlord thought her voice sounded sharper, more pressed. It was not hers. She was already dead. The letter had been written hours before, perhaps even the day prior. And someone, needing to confuse the hour, rearranged everything, the clock, the lamp, the curtains. Henry's face went white. Then you mean... I mean, said Whimsy, that your aunt was killed long before the morning, and her death dressed up as a melodrama. Which of you had the wit to contrive such details? That is what remains. He let the silence hang, the tick of the mantel clock mocking them with its false time. Then, with sudden briskness, he straightened. We shall not decide it here, but understand this.
The lie is cracking, the curtain is slipping, soon the guilty hand will reveal itself. Until then, keep your secrets close, they will betray you more loudly than any confession. With that, he extinguished the lamp, flung the curtains wide, and ushered them out into the mist, leaving the room once more bare of its theatrics. And as they went, Whimsy hummed a quiet bar of Mozart, as though already hearing the overture to the final act. The mist had thickened by evening, rolling over East Rotham like a cautious conspirator, muffling sound and blurring edges. Lamps glowed faintly behind curtains, boots scuffed hurriedly along the lanes, dogs barked at nothing visible. Whimsy relished it, striding with easy grace as though the fog were a silk cloak provided for his benefit. Sergeant Cribb followed at a more practical pace, muttering darkly that honest men ought to see where they put their feet. "Honest men, Sergeant," said Whimsy lightly, "are precisely the ones most likely to stumble. It is rogues who step confidently in the dark." Their destination was again Mrs. Penbury's cottage, now empty of her presence but alive with the echoes of deceit. Whimsy had requested one final gathering. Henry Penbury was already there, pacing by the cold grate. Emmes sat stiff-backed, hat on his knees. Mrs. Fortescue hovered near the writing-table, wringing her hands. The mantel clock ticked with maddening complacency, ignorant of the drama it had abetted. Whimsy entered with the air of a lecturer about to deliver his peroration. He removed his hat, placed it carefully on the chair-back, and addressed them with courteous cheer. "Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for indulging me once more. We have nearly reached the end of our little entertainment. The difficulty with murder, you see, is that it insists upon being logical, however melodramatic the disguise, and our Mrs. Penbury's death, arranged with curtains, lamp, and letter, has been melodrama of the most self-conscious variety." Henry burst out, "If you mean to accuse me again." "Accuse?" Whimsy raised his brows. "Dear sir, I accuse no one. I merely observe. And what I observe is that Mrs. Penbury was dead long before she was discovered. She died the previous evening, well before 8 o'clock, and thereafter her body was arranged, her letter produced, her clocks distorted. The telephone call at 8:10 was not hers at all." A murmur ran through the room. Emmes lifted his head sharply. Mrs. Fortescue gasped. Henry went rigid. "Consider," said Whimsy, pacing lightly. The ink on the page was dry, yet the pen placed in her hand. The mantel clock struck false quarters, yet its hands pointed faithfully fast. The lamp was lit, though the fire lay cold. The curtains were drawn at 8:30, seen by Miss Cottle, although Mrs. Fortescue insisted she found them closed at 9:30. These are not the accidents of a seizure, gentlemen. They are the deliberate, Misdirections of a stage play. Cribb growled. But who set the stage? Precisely. Whimsy turned, fixing each of them in turn with his monocle's gleam. Who had both the motive and the opportunity? Henry, the smooth nephew, eager for inheritance, is the obvious candidate. Too obvious. He profits, certainly, but his eagerness betrays him into honesty of a sort. He pressed her, but he did not silence her. He wanted her alive long enough to alter her will. If he killed her, he would have burnt the letter, not preserved it. Henry sputtered. Exactly so. I told you. Whimsy silenced him with a gesture. Emmes, then, summoned, yet he did not appear. A guilty man avoids the scene of crime, and yet, had he murdered her, would he not have seized upon the telephone call as proof of innocence? Instead, he shrinks from it. No, his silence is not that of guilt, but of shame. He feared being drawn into her affairs, perhaps into confidences he preferred to avoid. He is withholding truth, yes, but not murder. Emmes flushed, opened his mouth, then closed it again. Whimsy's gaze slid past him to Mrs. Fortescue. And so at last we come to you, madam. The faithful charwoman, first upon the scene, custodian of curtains, lamps, and clocks. You told us the pen was in her hand when you found her. Yet you later admitted you laid it down yourself. You told us the clock struck wrong. You told us the curtains had been drawn against reason. In fact, you told us almost everything we needed to know, for who but you had the chance to set the scene precisely as you described it? Mrs. Fortescue's lips trembled. No, my lord, I only tried to make her look decent. She was already gone. I didn't want folks to think she'd died untidy. Whimsy's tone softened, but his words were merciless. Ah, but in tidying, you became an accomplice to deception, and in that deception lies the clue. For you see, Mrs. Penbury was not writing to Henry, nor to Mr. Emmes, nor even to some mysterious lover. She was writing to you. My dearest was the voice of a mistress to her servant, one she relied upon, perhaps even confided in. She meant to tell you something before it was too late, and someone feared that confession. The charwoman's eyes filled with tears. She said she wanted to warn me about the will. She said Henry would cheat me of the little legacy she'd promised. She was going to put it down in writing so no one could deny it. But she never finished. She... Her voice cracked. Whimsy supplied the rest. She never finished because Henry arrived and silenced her. Not violently, not crudely. He was too cautious for that. A glass of something, perhaps, laced with a neat dose of digitalis or other household poison. She slumped in her chair before she could sign or seal her intention. And Henry, realizing what she had begun, contrived to disguise the moment. He drew the curtains, lit the lamp, tampered with the clock, and left the pen in her hand. Later, Mrs. Fortescue discovered her, and out of loyalty or fear, you preserved the appearance he had arranged. Henry's face drained of colour. This is monstrous! You have no proof. Proof, my dear sir, said Whimsy gently, is nothing but logic made visible. The doctor will find digitalis in her stomach. The exchange records will show no call made in her voice, and your motor, examined, will reveal the mud of East Rotham clinging to it at precisely the hour you claim to be at Darninghoe. Proof enough. Henry staggered, then laughed harshly. She would have wasted everything, left it to a servant, to a woman who scrubbed her floors. You expect me to endure that? The room went still. His words rang louder than confession. Cribb stepped forward, heavy and certain. That'll do, Mr. Penbury. You'll come with me. Henry sagged into the chair, face grey, the armband drooping like a parody of mourning. Mrs. Fortescue sobbed quietly into her apron. Emmes stared at the floor, jaw clenched in pity rather than triumph. Whimsy replaced his hat, sighed, and regarded the mantel clock once more. You see, Sergeant, the case was never about letters or lamps, but about time. Murderers can deceive people, but never clocks. They are obstinate, incorruptible witnesses. Once we listened to them, the truth struck the hour. He bowed slightly to the company, as though ending a performance. Good day to you all. I fancy the 4:15 to London will be punctual, unlike our lamented mantel clock. Let us hope justice proves equally reliable. And with that, Lord Peter Whimsy strolled out into the mist, humming a fragment of Mozart, leaving East Wrotham to its scandal, its sorrow, and its gossip, which would last far longer than any epitaph upon Mrs. Penbury's respectable stone.